Hi, good morning, everybody. Once again, it is actually my pleasure to be on this panel this morning for the following reason. UAS, C-UAS, one of the most critical aspects on new threats, risks, and vulnerabilities that our nation is facing. I'm going to use old stats. By old, I mean fiscal 23 for one sector. I won't name the sector. But in 23, there was 48,000 detections. Sector is about 120 miles, 5,200 incursions, and two of their most busiest stations were basically overwhelmed with what is known as encounters. Now, encounters are, and I'll leave it to the experts here to kind of talk to what these definitions mean. Encounters are divided into incursions into the United States, detections, and then counter surveillance flights, which to me, counter surveillance is one of the most dangerous things for our men and women that are operating on the ground, in the air, on the rivers, because the bad guys have eyes on what we're doing, where we're at, and how we're operating. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and begin this morning. The panel was introduced. There are a lot of challenges associated with taking on these new threats and risks and responsibilities. I'm going to ask Steve to very quickly go into some of the challenges that we have from a regulatory and policy perspective to kind of set the stage as to where we go next.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I think really to set the stage, and Clint, as one of our key operators, can speak volumes to this, but we are up against a deadline like we have been 12 times previous to this December. December 20th is the current expiration of our existing counter-UAS authority. That means come Christmas time, come Rose Bowl parade, come Super Bowl, none of those events, none of our ongoing departmental missions would be covered with counter-UAS protection. Now, we've been fortunate to have that authority renewed over time continuously in piecemeal short-term extensions. But this is one of the challenges that really puts us in a kind of a backslide from progress, in that we cannot appropriately budget, we can't strategically plan for the future, recognizing that our existing authorities expire in 10 days, and this piecemeal iteration of our authorities has been ongoing since about 2022. So with that in mind, it's very difficult for us strategically and organizationally with our components, CBP included, to say, hey, we need to start procuring, acquiring, and strategically planning for the future when our budget folks, our folks on the Hill say, well, we're not really sure if you're going to have these authorities in 2 weeks, right? And so it's sort of a chicken and egg conundrum where we're saying we need money, we need personnel, we need funding. All of those things have lead time before we can operationalize. And there's no expectation that we're going to have this authority on a longer term or more permanent basis moving forward. And so I think that helps set the stage for any conversation related to counter-UAS. And I like to kind of front load with that piece. But again, we do what we can with what we have. I think there's been an expectation that there's no desire to have the authorities lapse at any point, which is great for us. And I think there was, if anybody watched the hearing and the testimony from yesterday related to this topic, there was general support from folks on the Hill to say, this authority is important, we need to make sure that it continues, and we need to develop some sort of durable framework for you all to work against and strategically plan for. But that's what we're up against right now, and it's not great going out to your operators and saying, hey, you may have to cease and desist your operations in a matter of 2 weeks. Nobody likes to hear that.
In a matter of 2 weeks, and we've already mentioned this a couple of times, Steve touched on it also, inauguration, Super Bowl, all these other things, these NSSC events that are coming down the pike. And here we are 10 days out from the expiration of the only authority that we have that'll actually be able to counter. So again, that kind of sets the stage. Let me go to these two gentlemen on my left here, both of which I've worked with in the past. But to each of you, the actual challenges posed by unmanned systems especially in the rugged, remote areas of operations where I think today the flows are kind of directed, quasi-focused on the urban areas of operation, but very quickly it could be redirected and probably will be redirected by the cartels into rural and remote areas of operations. And to the EAC here, specifically in your area of air domain and security beyond the juridical line. So let me start with you, EAC member, please. Jonathan.
Thanks, Chief. And like you're well aware of, CBP's and Legacy Customs radar architecture and domain awareness, which is Air Marine's one of their primary mission sets, was designed for essentially general aviation size targets or ultralights and that type of target that's coming across the border, or short landing in Mexico to offload narcotics or contraband or whatever. So wasn't really designed for these small, slow, potentially dark targets, 1 meter or less. So that's what we're in the process of now, is redesigning the overall persistent wide area surveillance of the border to not forget about these historic targets, which are still a threat, but add into the fold this new and emerging threat. And it's not a cookie cutter approach. You have, like you mentioned, you have mountainous terrain, you have flat terrain, you have populated, unpopulated areas. There's different systems and different types of equipment that is going to be needed for each of these, and then fold into also the maritime environment. We see these types of threats in the maritime environment as well.
Okay. So what you talked about, Jonathan, was the additional challenges and threats. The others aren't going away. The others not going away. And unfortunately, the criminal minds are going to be evolving with anything that we do. So in the immediate, besides identifying what we can, we're just basically waiting for the authority and the technology to address whether kinetically or by, I guess, RF control of these platforms.
Right. Well, and like Mr. Willoughby said, the authority is a big piece from a program management, from an operations perspective. You can't run contracts or do long-term planning if your contractors or some of your employees are saying, "Hey, do we even have a program on December 21st?" And an answer like, "Well, there's general support," or "fingers crossed," not a good answer for planning. So, I think for CBP, our general strategy between Air Marine, OFO, and the Border Patrol is two parallel efforts. One is strategic, what I spoke to, rebuilding out, modernizing the architecture of the radars that we have today and our capabilities for domain awareness to include these small targets, but also the threat today. How are we going to fight the fight today? And that's something that Clint's team and the Border Patrol is more focused on, is some of these systems that are available, a little bit smaller in scope, smaller areas, but still very effective in detecting and mitigating in a variety of different ways to address the threat. And, I suspect, with the plans that in the future, when there's the more strategic architecture built out, be able to shed a lot of these systems and focus more on the mitigation aspects.
Right. Okay. Clint, let me go over to you. And as I understand it from my reading, there are levels of types of unmanned systems. 1, 2, 3, and I think 4, and in some cases 5. The responsibility, and I'm using these terms very, very carefully, because responsibilities, not division of responsibilities, but responsibilities lay at certain levels with you, and then the EAC takes the higher level because of the size, if you will, of the platforms. So can you talk about those unique challenges with the areas of platforms that you're responsible for?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I guess first the caveat, we don't know anything about New Jersey, so we'll just get that out of the way right now. But no, yeah, thank you for the question. So we're predominantly on the Border Patrol side of the house, as the EAC mentioned, focused on kind of the right now, the tactical problem, right? And I think to level set with everybody first, in CBP, we're a little different than everyone else doing counter UAS, right? Number one, we're doing it domestically, so there's a lot more concerns and limitations to our technology that we can deploy, right? We're not like DOD, we can't go overseas and play in a theater and blanket GPS jam everything and call it a day, right? So there's a lot of restrictions in place on us here. The second piece is, in CBP, we're not doing point defense, right? So we're not protecting the White House or a nuclear power plant or you name it, right? We're looking at linear miles of border, which is very different. And so the technology we deploy is going to be different from Secret Service and different from Coast Guard and our other federal partners domestically. So to answer the question directly, we are right now focused on this Group 1 and Group 2 UAS, right? So kind of the 55 pounds and under is that threshold set by the FAA that we're all familiar with domestically. That's our biggest problem right now. Are we being beat by dark drones here domestically? Are there GPS enabled or just completely RF silent drones, excuse me, crossing the border? Maybe, but I can tell you that there's thousands of drones a day crossing the border right now that are not dark, and we still can't answer that threat, right? So we kind of have to take this at the tactical level. I'm the guy that's taken just one step in front of the other trying to address the threat, all while in parallel effort, we work the strategic plan that the EAC was talking about. So our three biggest concerns for counter UAS right now for CBP, right, is counter surveillance. If you're going to move something illegally across the border, why not cheat, right? Fly a drone, you can see where the Border Patrol is, go around the Border Patrol. Day zero stuff, very easy. The second thing is the movement of illicit cargo. So whether these cartels want to move weapons, money, narcotics, they can attach it to a drone. That isn't done as common or as often as most people would think, because the counter surveillance piece, they can just say, hey, you can move 10 times as amount of cargo over here with the counter surveillance asset. So counter surveillance, moving illicit cargo. And the third thing is just airspace deconfliction, right? So EAC has a lot of aircraft flying around. Our DoD partners have a lot of aircraft flying. We want to make sure we're not running into these drones that are flying in the border environment. So you'll notice the big one I didn't mention is the kinetic threat, right? Is that a concern? Absolutely, it's a concern. We're seeing cartel on cartel violence in Mexico. Everybody sees the news of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That is a concern. But like everything else, there's an everyday concern of agents on the border. Are we going to be shot at? Or are we going to be, attacked? So we have to take these things in step. And those three I mentioned are really our focus for the program right now. And with that comes different types of technology, which I'm sure we'll get into eventually. But from a threat perspective, that's where we're sitting right now for CBP.
Okay. And by the way, because of the importance of this conversation, any questions that come up while we're going through this, please raise your hands, and we're going to allot some time at the end. But if there's anything that pops up in between, please don't hesitate to ask. So Steve, on the regulatory front, what we can do for C-UAS under the proper authorities, what is it we can do for C-UAS efforts being undertaken?
Yeah, I think CBP, fortunately, is well positioned right now within the legal framework. They have, in my opinion, all the authorities they need, again, to be within legal compliance and checking all the boxes with respect to relief from Titles 18 and 49, which are necessary to be able to counter this threat. Drones are, for a lack of a better definition, considered aircraft, right? And there's no difference between mitigating a drone and seizing a 747 in flight. In federal law, there is no distinction right now. And so we need relief from parts of federal law, such as aircraft sabotage, aircraft piracy, to be able to take control and seize these aircraft. And in addition to that, we need to be able to take advantage of the ability to decrypt and demodulate communication signals from these drones in order to understand where they are, where the operator is, where they're flying, and what threat they pose to our covered facilities or assets, right? And subsequently, we need relief from certain sections of Title 18, such as Wiretap Act, Computer Fraud and Abuse. These are laws that were designed 50, 60 years ago for different reasons, but have not been opined on as far as it relates to today's threat, which is drones and other things, right? And so we have to work within the existing framework, and the easiest way to do that is just say, well, you have relief from these federal provisions in order to do your job, in order to perform your normal law enforcement actions. CBP is a great example of a group that has, I believe, what they need legally. However, there are other parts of the department that are just as critical in this mission space that don't have what they need. And there are a number of pieces of legislation that are floating out there, but most explicitly, there's really, I think, three things that we're looking for from the department's perspective to help all of our components as well as our partners deal with this threat. The first is explicit inclusion of TSA as a component that can perform this mission. Right now, they are not called out in law, and so any threat at an airport can only be dealt with in a reactive posture. The second is getting our state and locals, the law enforcement organizations that are there as first responders, the first to respond in local jurisdictions, the authorities they need to detect, track, and identify these drones within their jurisdictions, so that when we have situations such as New Jersey or such as Joint Base Langley Eustis, where there are drones, there are sightings, there are things out there that we don't know, our state and locals, the ones that are there first, responding to these things day in and day out, have the authority to track and identify them and then respond accordingly within their local jurisdictions. And the third is a pilot program which would allow certain state and locals to be able to conduct mitigation in close partnership and sponsorship by DHS or DOJ, namely for protection of large sporting events or mass gatherings within their jurisdictions. All of these things are gaps in the existing legislative framework, things that we're pushing forward in partnership with the interagency, with the administration, with critical stakeholders out there that care about this threat. And so there's a lot of groups that are well positioned to do this. CBP has different issues than the authorities, right? Maybe more so looking at the extension and the durable application of those authorities so that they can strategically plan and resource and budget. But on the other side, there are components and there are stakeholders that don't have any authorities at all. And the operation of these systems would be illegal for them to do. And we need to rectify that and kind of right size where the authorities are right now so that we can deal with this threat on a national scale, again, across those critical infrastructure nodes that are most vulnerable.
EAC Miller, Super Bowl is coming up. Inauguration is going to be up. How much of a challenge will UASs and the C-UAS capabilities be to your operations in supporting that?
Well, I'll tell you, these days I pray for domed stadiums for sure, so that's helpful. Yeah, I think, and Mr. Willoughby hit on it, do we have capabilities that are adequate? Yes, we do. What we're lacking is capacity, and a lot of these events take a lot of manpower. Not only the Super Bowl, the inauguration, but looking in the near future, in 2026, we have the World Cup. 11 different venues in the United States for 6 weeks. In 2028, we have the Olympics, Paralympics in LA. Those are counter UAS operations on a unfathomable scale, and it's gonna, getting back to the authorities, it would be incredibly helpful to empower the state and locals to help out in these efforts, and not only that for SEER events, but it's one thing to create an architecture of counter UAS protection in a covered area along the border, but it's another completely different story with what's happening in New Jersey, where it happens in your neighborhood, and you don't have that architecture in place. It's not expected activity, but it still creates a threat. So you're relying on who's available there. I mean, you're talking about potentially a 10-minute flight. Who has the ability there to respond and act
In those areas, yeah, specifically. So, Clint, the issue you talked about, dark platforms. What does that mean, dark platforms? Obviously, you can't see them, but do we have an idea as to what the size of the problem is and potential solution sets?
Sure. So I think really right now, the best indicator is what is going on overseas in these different conflict zones, right? We see how fast the threat is adapting. It started with RC-controlled aircraft, years and years ago, and we started to move into better frequency ranges, your typical 2.4 and 5.8 frequencies. And so counter UAS kind of traditionally, when we started and got the legal authorities from Congress back in 2017, 2018 timeframe, that's what counter UAS was. And that's why we have relief from wiretap, pen trap trace, the Title 18 authorities that Steve talked to. But what we're seeing is the advancements in technology so fast, unfortunately driven by wartime, to defeat these defense capabilities. So we're just, unfortunately, we are experiencing that on our border as well. So as these cartels move away from the traditional frequencies that are used, even just simply by putting a SIM card like you have in your cell phone in a drone, now you can fly this drone from anywhere, right? You don't have to be within line of sight and using a known frequency, which is what our typical, everyday equipment that we've had for years is tuned towards. So right there, without even being dark, but moving to, let's say, the LTE frequency band, now you're mixing in with every other cellular device that's out there on the border. So from a detection standpoint alone, not even to mention defeat, but from detection alone, it's a lot more complicated. But even to take it a step further, pre-planned waypoints using GPS only and no command and control. So I take a drone, I tell it, and I map out on Google Maps where I want it to go. I launch that drone. Maybe it's to take a package from point A to point B. And now as the operator, I don't even have control of the drone anymore. I push launch, I can get in my vehicle and go grab a cup of coffee, and the drone's going to fly its own path, right? So, are we seeing that on the border? Yes, we are. But as the EAC mentioned, a lot of our current detection capability, like radar, isn't attuned to that. So I don't think we fully understand on the border the scope of it. We're trying to solve the first problem of counter surveillance with the drones that we can see. But you can estimate and draw numbers based on what we're seeing overseas and how fast they're adapting, that this change is coming. It's probably already here. But that's the essence. And going forward, right, getting into radars, better radars, getting into cameras, getting into acoustics, and frankly, getting into what we refer to as left of launch, right? More of intelligence-based approach to this. If we continue to chase the drone every day, we're forever going to be behind the technology curve. We have to get after the intelligence side of this, the left of launch, and target the financials and the supply chain and who's buying these, who's training these, and who's deploying them that are our adversaries, right? And so the more we can attack it from that left of launch front, I think the more success we're going to have in the future, despite which direction the threat goes.
Got it. So one of the things that on both sides, the regulatory and on the operational side, we have learned quite a bit on all things from the military. Mic's off. Good to go? I think I'm having trouble. Can you all hear me all right? I guess I got to raise my voice a little bit. So we've learned a lot from the military in the past on some of the things that we implement on the civilian side. Are we in any way paying special attention and learning from what's happening in theater right now with the multitude of drones that are being used, UASs that are being used over there, both for detection, for kinetic kills, for identifying the TTPs that they're using? Are we looking at that from?
Yes, absolutely. I would say from the detection standpoint, that's probably where we learn the most. Because despite where you're doing counter UAS and what you're doing it for, you need to detect, right? That's step one. So we are seeing advancements in everything I mentioned, from the RF spectrum to radars, cameras, et cetera. Where we are vastly different, unfortunately, from DoD in this space is the mitigation piece. Right. So you mentioned it earlier, do we use some sort of RF takeover device where we can take control of a drone and land it where we want? That's preferred in CBP because we don't have collateral damage. We want to get that drone and do forensics on that drone or try to run it further into an investigation. Where in the DoD world, a lot of times, as mentioned earlier, it's that point defense protection. How do I protect me, my people, my vehicles from one-way attacks, from more severe, kinetic attacks with munitions? So we unfortunately don't have the ability to push a button and launch a missile like a lot of these big DoD vendors have done, right? And go up and blow up a Group 1, 2, or 3 UAS. We're restricted by a lot of the things, policy-wise, legal-wise, and just risk here to operating in the national airspace. If we jam GPS, are we going to jam a Tesla driving down the road? Are we going to jam an aircraft that happens to be supporting our agents on the ground as well? We don't know, right? So we're a lot more tactful with our deployments right now. And that technology, it is based off a lot what DoD does. But that's kind of my challenge back to industry. And I know this will probably be towards the end of question here, but our ask is treat CBP a little different when you think about the solutions you're going to present, because we don't share that same mission space. We don't have the wide open authorities to utilize specifically the defeat options, right? It's a major challenge for us right now. Detection, we're learning a lot. It's the mitigation we struggle with here domestically. And I think that's, not to reference the New Jersey thing, but case in point, right? We're watching these things fly around all day long. What are we going to do about it? That's difficult in the domestic space.
Yeah, and just like everything that we learn from DoD, we have to apply it in a civilian law enforcement Homeland Security application. Not unlike how we applied our large UAS, our MQ-9s. The military uses MQ-9s as a weapons delivery system that's disposable. And we fly ours in the National Airspace System in a very different way, complying with FAA rules and regulations. When it comes to counter UAS, we have to, a lot of our authorities are based off of some of the anti-piracy FCC federal regulations that we have to overcome. And then, like Clint mentioned, when it comes to mitigation, we have to worry about, what's the potential collateral damage for that small UAS to fall out of the sky or drop its payload.
Right. So some of the progression and evolution that we have seen on the smuggling of people and narcotics, we went from cross-border incursions, basically backpacks. We went to ultralights. We now are seeing semi-submersible submarines. Are we far off from seeing Group 4 platforms bringing people, bringing payloads, narcotics, things, or are we already seeing some of that? I think we're seeing some of that on the lower level, but I'm talking the big players.
Yeah, I mean, you can't dismiss it. You have to build that into your plan for domain awareness. And I think if we build out a plan, our current plan to detect the 1 meter or less targets, whether through RF or active radar, I think we'll have that covered. The mitigation may be quite different.
Well, and I think this is where the conversation shifts a little bit from the threat to legitimate trade and travel, right? So private industry is already driving in certain areas. How are we going to move cargo, people, and things across the border legitimately, right? So we're going to need to employ the same type of detection, tracking, and let's not call it mitigation, maybe we call it course correction, right? If you're legitimately flying a package of cargo across the border through an aerial port of entry, and you inadvertently veer off course, we're going to need to be able to correct you and put you back on course to ensure safety of the national airspace. So this problem just snowballs and continues to go. It is the small 3 things I mentioned earlier that we're worried about, but here in the next several years, we're going to see aerial ports of entry. We're going to see containers being moved across the border, right, to avoid long lines at the port of entry. All that is going to come, and we need to be prepared, on this detection side of the house and course correction side to take care of it.
Aerial ports of entry.
Yeah, I think that might be an opportunity I think that'll definitely be an opportunity to apply AI in that as well, because I suspect when you're talking about creating small UAS, doing cross-border legitimate commercial deliveries, you're going to end up having to create some type of airways, just like we create roadways going through a port of entry. And so then once you do that, you've created a system where, hey, if you're here, you're right. If you're here, you're wrong. And having computer-based learning or AI be able to decipher that volume of traffic more so than a human being looking at a scope, I think is going to be required.
Steve, how does that come into influencing and shaping policy and regulations relative to, for example, an aerial port of entry, or the massive amounts of flights that the Amazons of the world are going to be doing? How do you take that into account, and what can industry do in any form or fashion to help shape or influence that?
Yeah, I think EAC Miller got to this a bit in his comment. There has to be some sort of foundational understanding of the airspace out there. Unmanned, the same way that we have for manned right now. You can open up FlightAware and look at every manned aircraft that's broadcasting ADS-B out there across the world, across the nation, in your backyard, right? You can look up and say, oh, look, there's a plane, and in real time deconflict it with a known flight and tail number and various information. We need that same level of integrity for unmanned flights, especially on the commercial side, that we have for manned aviation right now. And all of that will help us deconflict those flights that are authorized, that are supposed to be there, with those that aren't, with those that are not complying with the rules. All of this builds around the conversation and the collaboration that we have to have with the FAA on a regular basis as far as who has the right to the airspace. And FAA as an integrator, as a regulator, their position is everybody has a right to the airspace, and we would agree with that. And of course, we encourage the integration of these drones into the airspace compliantly, right? And what we've seen is there's a culture of noncompliance, right, within the recreational users here domestically, and there's a intentional noncompliance, right, for those that are out there doing nefarious work south of the border, within the homeland, and abroad in theater. And being able to have that baseline understanding of who's supposed to be there, who's authorized to fly in these routes, in these airways, coming through this aerial port of entry, if that's where we end up, and saying, hey, there's 12 drones flying in this space right now. 10 of them I've already deconflicted and know that they're supposed to be there, but there's 2 that I have a concern with, right? And I can focus my limited manpower and resources on going after those 2 and understanding what they're doing, why they're there, what the intent is, versus having to look at all 12 and say, I've got a real problem, but I can only address a couple with my limited resources. And so having that baseline understanding of the airspace, working collaboratively with the FAA to say, here is a national level look at the airspace. Here are all the systems that are broadcasting remote ID, which is a baseline requirement for every drone activity in the United States right now. Compliance levels are not where we would like them to be, right? And of course, we look at that as an immediate red flag from a law enforcement standpoint, right? If you're not compliant with the baseline regulations, then I want to know more about you, right? I want to follow you. I want to see where you're going. And it's just part of a normal law enforcement response to, hey, if you're speeding on the roadway, it's possible you're breaking other rules, right? And again, that's an oversimplification of the explanation that I'm getting at. But again, all of that plays into our ability to deconflict the airspace in real time in a matter of seconds, where you have a decision to determine if this thing is a threat or not to your personnel or to your assets. So I think that's where we need to get to. There's a long road to get there, and I think we're trending in the right direction with some of these rules, some of these partnerships. But CBP will be a huge benefactor of a deconflicted and collaborated airspace in the unmanned world, much like we have for manned aviation.
From a regulatory perspective, are we trying to influence already the aerial ports of entry, for example, and the massive, what we used to call the threat in the mix? At our ports of entry, land ports of entry and airports, there's a massive amount of inflow, but within that, there are the threats are mixed in. Those are the ones that we're concerned about. So are we already looking at that from a regulatory perspective? Because right now it seems that every time we talk about regulations or exploration, it's about what's happening on the border. Critically important, but very quickly we're going to be faced with this other aerial port of entry threat. I mean, are we going to have a CTPAT for aerial ports of entry?
I mean, I think we're not there yet, but we're at the foundational point where folks are starting to look at these more advanced operations and the integrated use of commercial drones for deliveries, for inspections of critical infrastructure, whatever it may be. And we look at rules that are on the docket for consideration. There's a beyond visual line of sight rule for anybody that's in the unmanned drone space, right? This is the ability for commercial operators to fly their drones consistently beyond visual line of sight, which is currently not allowed, right? This is a game changer as far as how we in law enforcement are getting after the individual who's responsible for a potential illicit or nefarious activity. If you're not within line of sight of that drone, I have infinitely more challenges getting after you to do my normal law enforcement response, to interdict, to engage, and determine intent, all of which help part of that investigative kill chain or process, whatever it may be. And so ensuring that security partners and stakeholders in this space are contributing to those rules as they come out from our safety regulator is going to be critical. And I think, again, setting us up for success in that more advanced culture downstream will be very important with again, laying the foundation in these early rules.
Yeah, I have to wonder, I think, can y'all hear me all right? Okay. I know I've seen Al Gina here, John Wagner was here earlier, Diane Sabatino was here earlier. I have to wonder if we are taking into account from the CBP perspective, the port of the future that includes this kind of situation. Because the bad guys are always going to look for the opportunities to mix in with the legitimate trade and traffic. Trade and travel, trade and traffic, cargo, and things of that nature. So again, I pose that question, industry, what should we be looking at from the outside to support that future evolution of what we're facing today? EAC Miller, the domain awareness and security architecture, we talked about it a little bit over there. Would you give us a sense of the direction we're going on that?
Yeah, so, like I said, we are, systematically taking a look at our current radar architecture across all of our borders. Like we said, historically, that's been a blend of our own radars, whether they're on the ground, they're on a tethered aerostat, they're on a tower. We integrate FAA radars, we integrate other radars from other components into an intersecting picture of domain awareness for everything. Now, looking at threat areas and now folding in those meter or less targets that can either be detected by RF signal or active radar or both. That's kind of where we're at, and like any project, we're prioritizing. We're looking at it. We're working with the Border Patrol and saying, hey, where are we going to start? That's kind of, we started this out, knock out the highest threat areas, test, see what works, see what doesn't, see how the threats react, and move on and build and evolve. And like I said, it is not a cookie cutter approach. Every single sector or AOR requires kind of different tuning to optimize that domain awareness. And it's domain awareness. You talk about, we had 45,000 detections in FY24 alone. A significant amount of those never crossed the border. So that's your reconnaissance and your surveillance. So not only building out our architecture, but enabling our partners in Mexico to have kind of the capabilities to do detections and mitigations on these small UAS that never cross the border.
45,000 detections. We have to ask ourselves, what were those platforms supporting from a criminal activity? And that's what we're facing on these borders. And that's the detections. Then there's the dark ones that we didn't see, the ones that we can't see. So let me, we've got about 10 more minutes to go. Let me ask three participants here. What would you ask of industry to focus on going forward to assist in the fight? You've covered some of these areas, but if there was a top two things that you would ask, what would you ask from them in assistance?
Proprietary systems don't help. Proprietary systems don't help, and proprietary systems don't help.
Well,
it's very helpful if we could take new technology and have it integrate with all of our systems. So the goal, as unlikely as it is a single piece of glass in terms of domain awareness, and having different proprietary systems that require different monitors and different systems doesn't help us out. So that I would offer that consideration. Of course we look at these things because they're great technology, but it creates an added level of complexity when we're trying to put it all together.
Okay. Clint?
Kind of a hardware and software, I guess, side for me. So to go along with that and the proprietary equipment, there is no single solution for counter, right? You mentioned all the different sensor modalities, from radars to cameras to acoustics to RF stuff. So I said it earlier, kind of think of CBP different when it comes to the defeat capability in particular. We're not the same as DoD. We're operating domestically, and we have this law enforcement hat on. So we want to let legal folks fly, but we also need to be watching them to make sure, like Steve kind of made the comparison with cars and speeding, right? We have to monitor the air traffic and very selectively pull people out of that and say, hey, you're doing something wrong, right? So from a hardware perspective, how do we do this and not be so invasive, right? With all the civil rights and civil liberties concerns and the way everyone wants to fly drones, we want to enable that, but we also need the ability to reach up and touch you if we need to. So a lot of the solutions were presented are, hey, I got this cool laser, or I got this, thing that's going to make that go boom or fall down. Like it's just not applicable in our environment, right? So from the hardware perspective, think about us a little different than you do a lot of the DoD folks. And then on the software side, I know there's a lot of AI discussions and a lot of data folks here that are way smarter than I on this topic, but that's can't be emphasized enough with this, both right now and when we get to the aerial ports of entry. As Steve mentioned, we're going to have to combine all this data and make sense of it. So much data in real time that we're going to have to sort through and figure out what's the top 5% of things I need to pay attention to and what else can I ignore, right? So there's thresholds, there's risk, there's everything we need to build into that. But right now, even if we're asked how many drones crossed the border last night, we have 6, 8, 10, 20 different counter-UAS sensors along the border from y'all, and none of them talk to each other. So we have to add all this stuff up individually ourselves, remove duplicative flights, and try to make sense of the data. It's a very difficult task now, let alone when we add more sensors and aerial ports of entry in the future. So kind of that hardware solution, think of us different. And software side, there's a lot of work to be done. And what all that includes, I don't know. That's not my area of expertise, but it's definitely a problem set we're coming up on very fast.
Okay. Steve?
I'll take the hot take for the panel here. Enough with RF, right? RF is the past, right? It will remain, people will still continue to use it, right? That is not the threat of tomorrow, and we need to be researching and testing against the threat of tomorrow. We're already seeing it in the Ukraine, in the Middle East, right? They're not even flying drones with wireless connections anymore. They're connecting fiber optic cables, right, and flying without a wireless connection, right? How do we deal with that, right? And those are the questions that we need to be looking at, I think, moving forward. RF will persist and will be the mainstay for recreational users, for the general, off-the-shelf products. But I care less about those and more about how folks are using the new technology, the new innovations to perpetrate their criminal activity, whatever it may be. So don't stop working with RF, but let's turn the corner to figuring out ways to reconfigure those radars to be able to detect, radar, get those cross sections down to where we can have a great detection rate for drones deconflicted with birds and other biologics, right? Let's look at acoustics or EOIR cameras that are capable of slewing and queuing to a radar hit, to another detection, and can help you put eyes on a target and determine what threat level you need to be concerned with, right? Those are the things that I think we're looking at, and they're really the evolutions of the technology that's evolved over the last 20 years, but is now on a new evolution time frame of about 6 to 8 weeks in these conflict zones, where they are coming up with new measures and countermeasures and evolutions to the tech on that 2-month iteration scale. So that would be my encouragement.
I had never heard that. Enough on RF. But that makes all the sense in the world. Exactly. Any questions from the audience? Right here, please.
Thank you. Where does the U.S. citizen fit in all this? So some thoughts that, do we have incidents with citizens shooting down drones at this point? With things happening in Jersey the other night, these things come to my mind, how much space does an American citizen own above his house before he or she can take action against a drone? And with the number of drones that are coming over the southern border, I would expect some people are like, hey, why don't I just start having fun and start shooting some of these out of the sky? So kind of where's the talk where the citizen actually sits in these conversations?
I mean, from our perspective, and my deputy was on the Hill testifying with the Maritime and Transportation Subcommittee. And, I think these events, like what's happening in New Jersey, it's unintended consequence. It gets Congress talking, and it starts to hit the gas on pushing these initiatives. And on the flip side, I think we can increase and start taking more seriously the penalties for violators. Whether they're just careless or even the criminal. You know, even the careless ones. We need to up the penalties for these people. So so they know we're taking this serious, and we view this as a national security threat.
I would just add, the definition of airspace is technically an inch off the ground, right? If you jump, you're momentarily in the airspace, right? And that's a broad interpretation of what we're talking about here. But the legal response is if you take a bat to a drone in your backyard, whether or not it's doing something criminal or not, right? You've committed aircraft sabotage, right? Now, is somebody going to prosecute you for that? Yeah, we'll leave that up, for your own imagination. But that's the definition that we are working against here, right? All of these drones have a right to the airspace so long as they are compliant with the regulations, incumbent upon however they're operating, whether that's commercially or recreationally. Now, there are local statutes and jurisdictions that have implemented certain laws that say, well, you can't fly a drone for the purposes of conducting other criminal activity, right? Whether that's voyeurism or trespassing or conveyance, whatever it is. But again, that's only at a local level, and that is very inconsistent across the nation, right? And so, we look at, didn't really want to go here, but we'll look at New Jersey, right? There's not a lot of illegal actions going on, right? And people can fly drones at night. It's allowed right now. And police departments and other institutions are also flying their own drones to find out what these other drones are, right? And so suddenly you have people reporting blue drones, right? They're like, oh my God, there's this thing in my backyard. Well, it's just the New Jersey State Troopers doing their thing. And so it gets really complicated really fast, and we don't want to dismiss any of these circumstances for what they are, and it's possible that there is nefarious or illicit activity ongoing, but without that framework that I mentioned earlier, without that understanding of who's in the airspace and whether or not they're supposed to be there, this will continue to occur.
Okay, gentlemen, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Complex, challenging, difficult, and we need the help from industry. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Steve?